Alberta's Finance Minister Jason Nixon announced that the books are pretty good shape here for the province. The budget surplus was $3.9 billion. Now, to discuss this in more detail is our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent with the National Post, Tyler Dawson, who joins us once again from Edmonton. Tyler, the $3.9 billion is a lot better than that projected deficit of close to $17 billion just a couple of short years ago during the height of the pandemic?
Yeah, for a long time there, the numbers were looking pretty bad. And, even if we go back just a few months to the February budget, they projected a surplus of more like 500 million. And obviously in the billions is a lot bigger than that. And I would just mention a little bit here, because listeners and watchers might have thought, Jason Nixon, isn't he the environment minister? Well, there was a little bit of a cabinet shuffle because, of course, there have been a number of cabinet ministers who've left to run in the UCP leadership race, among them Travis Taves, the former finance minister. So that is perhaps, if anyone sort of cocked an eyebrow at that one, that's what's going on there. But yeah, the financial situation for the province is looking pretty good, and that's largely because of the price of oil. You may have noticed it at the gas station. Governments are noticing it too, as money is sort of rolling into the provincial coffers. The question, of course, is what's going to happen with that money?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, will we be able to pay down some of that $93 billion debt? What are you hearing?
Yeah, that seems to be part of the plan. There was some talk in the budget documents several months ago about putting money into the Heritage Fund and also paying down the debt. So I think we're going to see a combination of that. So far, I'm sorry to report, I haven't heard much of anything about getting some Ralph bucks mailed out to Albertans this time around.
Yeah, I talked to Premier Jason Kenney about that a couple of months ago, and he says, those dividend checks, yeah, we're going to hold off until we can pay down some more of that debt here. Now, Tyler, still with the economy, a TD Economics report says Alberta's economy is set to grow by around 5.5% this year. Now, how does that compare to the rest of the country?
Well, it certainly leads the country in growth. It's like almost 4 times what growth is expected to be in Newfoundland and Labrador, and about 2 full percentage points higher than in Ontario and British Columbia. Saskatchewan right on our heels, I think at about 4.9% growth this year. So, no matter how you sort of look at it, the Alberta economy is doing very well, pretty much on a number of metrics, as well as it's done basically since before the sort of 2015 oil price crash. So, it's a really interesting time politically, of course, because there's an election in less than a year. Governments going into an election with a booming economy are likely to do well. The economy is, of course, going to be part of the UCP leadership race. It's going to be part of what Rachel Notley is trying to do over the next year. It's part of the budgeting process and all the discussions about that. And the other thing I would just point out is University of Calgary economist Trevor Tombe pointed out on social media the other day that this isn't even just relegated to the recovery of the oil and gas and mining sector. Actually, pretty much every sector across the economy is seeing an improvement in jobs in particular, which suggests this is a wider ranging boom or small boom perhaps than might otherwise be expected.
I think your dog agreed with that comment there too.
No, he's not behaving himself.
So Tyler, UCP leadership candidate Danielle Smith launched her campaign in a pretty big way. She says one of her first orders of business, should she become premier, would be to have Alberta opt out of federal laws the provincial government really doesn't like. Is this the brainchild of the Free Alberta strategy?
It is. So this was a document from maybe about a year ago now from a University of Calgary political scientist, lawyer, and former Wild Rose member of the Legislative Assembly. And they wrote this whole document, sort of part of this conversation about more Alberta autonomy, Western alienation, all that stuff that, you and I have talked about a bunch before. So this strategy detailed ways in which Alberta could sort of gain more power. And honestly, it went sort of far beyond what the government has said in terms of let's get our own police force, let's get our own pension plan, those sort of things. They're saying, look, we're going to have this act that would allow us to opt out of federal legislation, to opt out of federal regulatory decisions we don't like, to ignore federal court rulings. And Danielle Smith has sort of adopted that, at least in part. And so this was one of the first sort of big policy platform planks, shall we say, coming from the UCP leadership candidates, and it made a bit of a splash. The question, of course, is whether or not that would do anything, whether or not Alberta could, in fact, opt out of federal legislation. And I talked to some experts when she announced this, constitutional experts and lawyers, and they said full stop that this is not really, a workable proposal, that, even if the Alberta government could say, look, this federal regulatory decision doesn't apply to the business sector, well, businesses are going to follow federal law, not what the Premier of Alberta is saying. So, but all that aside, setting that aside for a second, whether or not this is a workable proposal, I think the important thing to note here is that this suggests that Alberta autonomy, Western alienation, all this stuff that's actually been sort of quiet for the last year or so, year or two maybe because of the pandemic, is going to come back in a very real way as part of the UCP leadership race and potentially part of the provincial election next year.
Now, another former Wildrose Party leader, Brian Jean, is also on the Autonomy for Albertans train. Now, he doesn't believe in a sovereign Alberta, an independent country, but instead wants to really focus on fixing our relationship with Ottawa.
That's right. And, so in a lot of ways, that echoes what Premier Jason Kenney has been saying for the past 3 or so years. That there are problems within Confederation, there are problems with equalization, there are problems with the development of energy projects and pipelines, but that these are things that can be worked upon within Confederation. So Brian Jean is very much promising a different managerial style among his caucus, very much a different tone as leader of the party and premier potentially of the province. But in terms of the importance of this sort of alienation thing, he's very much talking about that as well. So as I said a moment ago, I think this is really going to be a theme among the leadership candidates. The real question in a lot of ways going forward is just how much do Albertans care about this at the moment, not just members of the United Conservative Party. And so there's probably a little bit of saying the things that the party members want to hear, that the base wants to hear. And then we'll have to see certainly how big of an issue that ends up being in the provincial election.
Some political pundits say that it's really Travis Taves to lose. Other people say, some of the other frontrunners are Brian Jean, Daniel Smith. Where do some of the frontrunners stand when it comes to implementing a provincial police force? Will they still follow through with Jason Kenney's vision?
That's a really good question and not something I've seen them talk about just yet. I feel like we are in the stage where they're sort of thinking about policy and thinking about announcements because as I sort of mentioned, we haven't seen a ton of sort of substantive policy. But that sounds like a great story idea that I should do in the next week or so.
Now, Tyler, the Alberta government will get to give a presentation to the Public Order Emergency Commission, which is looking into Ottawa's decision to invoke that Emergencies Act during the Freedom Convoy in Ottawa there. Now, government officials say they're more than happy to discuss the dangerous precedent that Trudeau Liberals set.
Yeah, so the Alberta government was sort of opposed to this at the time and said so vocally at the time. Said that this was an intrusion on provincial responsibility, that provincial police and governments had all the powers they actually needed to prevent these sorts of things and break these sorts of things up. Because, of course, there was the Coots border protests about the same time as this. So Alberta did sort of, Alberta could have been the government that fully supported this. Not likely, I think, politically speaking, but given the circumstances. So Alberta will get to do a full presentation. I believe Saskatchewan will as well. And Manitoba is going to get to submit written responses. So this is just for a brief piece of background. This is the commission that studies the use of the Emergencies Act. I believe it has to happen after the Emergencies Act is implemented. And so they've been hearing from police, they've been hearing from the governments, or the federal government, I should say, and they're now going to hear from Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. And I would also just add that Alberta had promised at the time to launch a lawsuit against the federal government for its use of the Emergencies Act, and was also seeking to be an intervener in some of the sort of private lawsuits, I guess, shall we say, against the use of it. So a bit of a long-ish history, shall we say, of opposing this use.
Let's circle back to the discussion of a potential police force, provincial police force, like they have in Ontario with the OPP. Now, the union representing the RCMP in Alberta has launched another campaign to keep the force right here in the province, with 72 organizations and municipalities signing a letter to keep the RCMP right here in Alberta.
Yeah, so we talked a couple of weeks ago about Tyler Shandro writing a op-ed in the Red Deer Advocate about the police force, and that this was still sort of on the government's radar, which I think I'd said at the time kind of surprised me a little bit because I felt like we hadn't heard about it in a long time. The union, of course, is not leaving any of that up to chance, and so they have this open letter that's available for municipalities to sign, and they're saying they've got 72 organizations and municipalities. So the mayor of High River, I believe, was one of them. Edson, I think, was another one. Not a massive list of municipalities at this point, but it really just goes to show that the RCMP union is not about to lose its policing capabilities in Alberta without a little bit of a fight. And so whether the next United Conservative Party leader decides to go ahead with that as an actual platform policy, or, who knows, maybe the NDP will win the next election and they'll decide to do it. Either way, there's going to be, I think, a pretty tense standoff between the government and the police union over this.
Tyler, a former NDP MLA, Thomas Dang, is facing up to $200,000 in charges for breaching health privacy rules for a hacking operation that exposed security flaws in Alberta Health's vaccine portal. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, so if we cast our minds back to the vaccine portal where you could go in and find out your vaccination status and all that sort of fun stuff, Thomas Dang had essentially ran a program or a script on a computer to sort of force his way through the portal. And he got to a point where he sort of realized that he would be able to view private health information and notified Alberta Health that he had found this sort of security flaw. And the outcome of that was that there was another layer of security added, and that an RCMP investigation was launched into his conduct there. So that investigation would have come out around December, I believe, and he resigned from the NDP caucus. And that investigation wrapped up just a week or so ago, and he is now facing a charge under sort of the Health Information Act kind of thing for this. And his first court date, I think, is in July, late July. And I don't think there's been an indication yet of how he plans to plead in that case. So another thing to keep an eye on, just sort of an interesting one-person sideshow, I guess, in the legislature.
Tyler, Calgary Tory MP Michelle Rempel Garner says she's not decided to throw her hat into the ring to seek the UCP leadership. Why not?
Well, she was sort of the person that everyone was kind of waiting to hear from. Would have some of that brand recognition, is quite socially progressive, has a long record as a federal Conservative MP. So I think she really would have made a splash had she decided to enter the leadership race, whether she won or lost. She said there were a number of reasons, but the one that reporters really seized on, that pundits have seized on, is she basically just said, look, the party's in chaos. There's huge divisions within this party. And she said, I don't know if I'm equipped to try and deal with those divisions. So she's not doing it. She was working on Patrick Brown's campaign for leader. And, but her sort of aside from Alberta politics, her political future is, I think, a little bit uncertain right now because she was involved in the leadership. Patrick Brown at this point does not look like he's going to win that leadership. So it's a little bit unclear where her career goes from here. But what we can say at this moment is it's not going to be as the leader of the United Conservative Party.
Leela here, another leadership hopeful for the UCP, is looking at pausing the implementation of the K-6 curriculum. Now, Tyler, this is not the social studies curriculum that's been so controversial, but more on health, language arts, and math?
Yeah, so there's sort of a rolling rollout, shall we say, of some of these curriculum items. This is like K-3 math and things like that. And it has been controversial, with some experts saying it's better than the old one, but still has problems and so on and so forth. Not as like outrightly controversial. No one's tramping down the streets of Edmonton angry about the K-3 math curriculum yet, or that I've seen anyways. So she said she wants to sort of pause it and reflect, and that it's rolling out a little bit too quickly. The problem, of course, is by the time the leadership race happens, which is in October, or the vote, I guess, the curriculum will already be in schools, and it would be a little bit late to pull it all back. So, a little bit of a sign of some of the other issues we might see in the leadership race that's worth keeping an eye on, and certainly some of the more social issues. I think we're going to hear about education, healthcare, that kind of stuff. So just a little note on one of the other things happening in the leadership race.
Jason Kenney was back in Washington recently making more pitches. What was our premier pitching this time?
Well, more oil and gas, more or less, and some decarbonization, energy security, that kind of stuff. Even though the man is resigning and will be out of the picture, he certainly hasn't slowed down. He was in Washington just days, I think, before the leadership vote came out. And yes, he was down there with oil and gas sort of industry people and decarbonization people this time, as opposed to being before congressional leadership, is my understanding. But, it just goes to show that, with gas prices where they are in Canada and the United States and the war in Ukraine continuing, inflation where it's at, this pitch to the Americans is still very much part of the Alberta government strategy, even if Jason Kenney's not going to be the premier after October.
It's interesting. It's nice to see oil doing so well and, filling our coffers here, paying down the debt, but at the same time, look at the price of the pumps, right? So you can have it one or either way, I guess.
Yeah, I'd just be thankful, I guess, we're not out on Vancouver Island.
Yeah, no kidding. He's our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent for the National Post, Tyler Dawson. Thanks for joining us today from Edmonton.
Thanks for having me, Hal.